because life is so full of suffering, even good lives are very much full of suffering, that it's wrong to bring children into the world because the suffering outweighs the good, even in good lives. And it's actually wrong, it would also be better not to exist for exactly the same reason. And my sense in reading the book is that he came to that conclusion and then wrote the book to justify it, which is actually the reverse of the way that you should write a book. What you should do when you're writing a book is you should have a question, and it should be a real question, right? It should be one you don't know the answer to. And then you should be studying and writing like mad and reading everything you can get your hands on to see if you can actually grapple with the problem and come to some solution. And you should walk the reader as well through your process of thinking so that they can come to the, well, not necessarily to the same conclusion, but at least track what you're doing. And I don't think that's what he did. I think he wrote it backwards. But then, and so I was thinking about it a lot, because that's actually a question that I've contended with in my writing. There are Mephistophelian or satanic figures, for example, in Goethe's Faust, and also Ivan in the Brothers Karamazov, who basically make the same case, that existence is so rife with trouble and suffering that it would be better if it didn't exist at all. And the problem I've had with that, there's a variety of them, but one of the problems I've had with that is what happens if you start to think that way, because what I've observed is that people who begin to think that way, that isn't where they stop. Like, they get angry at existence, which is what happened to Cain, as we saw in the Cain and Abel story, and then the next step is to start taking revenge against existence, and that cascades until it's revenge against, well, I think the best way of thinking about it is revenge against God for the crime of being, which is, I think, the deepest sort of hatred that you can entertain. And when you're in the grip of a really deep emotion, like a really profound emotion, right at the bottom of emotions, you're in something that's like a quasi-religious state, and that's more or less independent of your belief, say, in a transcendent deity. I mean, you can be in a profoundly emotional state that's as deep as it can be, and it can have religious significance without that necessarily signifying anything about a transcendent being, But then I was thinking, see, the problem with that argument is you can gerrymander it endlessly, because first of all, how do you measure suffering and how do you measure happiness? It's like, how do you assign weights to them? And God, there's just no way of doing that. You have to do it arbitrarily. And so you can make an argument that the suffering outweighs the happiness. You just weight the suffering more heavily than you weight the happiness, and that's the end of that, And so that's a problem. But I think there's a deeper problem. And I was reading this other book a while back as well, which was written by the guy who ran the Human Genome Project. And I don't remember exactly what it was called, but it was something like The Scientist's Case for God, or something like that. And one of the things he referred to, which didn't strike me as hard as it should have to begin with, was he thought that one of the phenomena, say, that justified a belief in a transcendent being was something like the moral intuition of human beings, that we have a sense of right and wrong. And it's certainly what happens in Genesis in the story of Adam and Eve is that story announces the coming of the sense of right and wrong, right? The knowledge of good and evil. And it isn't something we ascribe to animals. It's something that's unique to human beings. Animals can be predators and they can be gentle and you can have a relationship with them, but you never think of an evil cat or an evil wolf, even though they're predatory. But human beings, we have this capacity to judge between good and evil, right and wrong. And it's really an integral part of our being. And I think you can make an evolutionary case for that, a biological case for that, as you can make a biological case for most of what is relevant about human beings, because we're biological creatures. But we don't really understand the significance of that. Like, what happens in the story of Adam and Eve is that realization, that coming to the knowledge of good and evil, is actually represented as a shift of cosmic significance, right? It puts a permanent fracture in the structure of being. And, if you think of human beings as insignificant ants on a tiny dust mote in the middle of an infinite cosmos, a cosmos that cares less for us, then who cares fundamentally if human beings have the knowledge to distinguish between good and evil. But if you give consciousness a central role in being, and you can make a perfectly reasonable case for that, because without consciousness there's no being, as far as anyone can determine, so it may be much more central than we think. And I really don't think there's a counter-argument to that. Like, not a solid one. You can state that consciousness is epiphenomenal and that the world is fundamentally materialistic and it doesn't matter that there's consciousness. You can state that, but you can make an equally credible case the other way. And certainly our lived experience is that consciousness is crucial, obviously, and we treat each other as if most of the time we're valuable conscious beings, and we wouldn't give up our consciousness, even though it's often consciousness of suffering. And so then I think another problem with the book is that it's sort of predicated on the idea that life is for happiness. And I don't think that's right, and I don't think that's how people experience life, and I might be wrong, but it seems to me that people experience life as something like a series of crucial ethical decisions. It's something like that. I mean, I just can't imagine, and maybe I'm being naive about this, but I can't imagine another being that's like me in most senses, that isn't constantly wrestling, in some sense, with what the next proper thing to do is. It's not like it's obvious. It's not bloody obvious. And it doesn't mean you'll do the right thing, because you don't, lots of times. And you know that by your own judgment, right? Because you're making mistakes all the time. Sometimes you don't know what you're doing, and maybe it's a mistake, and maybe it isn't. And who's to say? But that isn't what I'm talking about. I'm talking about when you know that what you're doing is wrong, and you go ahead and do it anyways. People do that all the time. And that's also extremely peculiar. You bloody well think that if you knew it was wrong, and you told yourself that it was wrong, that would be sufficient, so that you just wouldn't do it. But that isn't what you're like at all, you know. And you can tell yourself something is wrong 50 times, and you'll do it the 51st time, and then you'll feel, you know, like you deserve to feel, probably. But it doesn't stop you. And so then I think the other problem with the viewpoint, the idea that the suffering of life eradicates its utility, is that it's predicated on the idea that happiness, or lack of suffering even, is the right criteria by which to judge life. And I don't think that's how we actually experience life. I think what we do instead is put ourselves through a series of excruciating moral choices. You know, and one of the things that's really significant about the biblical stories, and I think about the entire implicit philosophy, you know, that's embedded in the stories, is that that's how life is presented in the stories, is all of these individuals. First, they're individuals, they're not groups. And second, they're agonizing over their moral choices all the time. And they have a relationship with God. But it's not a directive relationship, exactly. Even the people to whom God speaks directly, which I suspect is not something you'd exactly want to have happen, they're still, even the fact that they have a direct relationship with God doesn't stop them from being tormented continually by their moral choices. And so the world is presented as a moral landscape, not as a place that justifies itself by happiness. It's presented as a moral landscape, and people are presented as creatures who traverse through the moral landscape, making ethical decisions that determine the course of the world. And that seems to me to be right. And that's not the same as happiness by any stretch of the imagination. It's a whole different category of being. And, you know, and then I've thought that through a lot, and I think, well, we do make choices, and what we do is contend with the future, you know. And the future seems to appear to us as a realm of possibility. That's a more accurate way of thinking about it than that the future presents itself to us as a realm of determined things. It presents itself as a realm of possibility, and there's good choices in that realm, and there's poor choices or even evil choices in that realm. And we're negotiating continually, deciding which of those choices we're going to bring into being. That seems to me to be phenomenologically indisputable, and we certainly treat each other as if that's what we're doing, because we hold each other responsible for our actions, you know, with some exceptions, and that we're deciding each moment whether to make things better or worse. And that seems to me to be correct. And there's a profound anti-human ethos, I think, that pervades our culture, that considers human beings cancers on the planet, something like that, and that there should be less of us. It's the same spirit that motivated the guy who wrote the book about it better to have never been. And it's like, I don't see it that way, I mean, I think people do pretty well for having their leg caught in a bear trap and their head caught in a vice. They're actually doing pretty well, because life is really hard, and the fact that we're not absolutely brutal and murderous all the time is really something remarkable, given what we actually have to contend with, that we can go out of our way to be honest and generous and altruistic and to care for each other under unbelievably dire circumstances, and to act nobly sometimes under the most trying conditions. In Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, he tells story after story of people who acted abysmally, but also people who, under the worst threats imaginable, never sacrificed their character. And reading about that is really, well, it really makes you wonder. That's what it does.